welcome to this morning's brief presentation on systemic work with organizations. This is a broad body of knowledge, a large collection of information, and I'm going to try my best to condense all of the thinking and theory into about 15 minutes, just to give people a sense or a flavor of what it's like to work in a systemic way with companies. Now, I've been working as a systems consultant for over 25 years in the clinical and management field. So I'm very used to applying them in different contexts. I think working with systems such as organizations is slightly different to working in the clinical field for quite a host of different reasons, but primarily we can leave an organization, we can't leave a family, or we can't leave a pathology. So when it comes to the perceptions that lead to psychopathology in the clinical context, a lot of those issues are between self and self. In companies, it's often between two people. That doesn't mean that we can't take aspects from the clinical field and translate them and transfer them into a systemic organizational context, but they're two slightly different things. So when we're thinking about systems thinking in companies, what is it we're talking about? Well, at the coaching clinic, we've been doing a lot of work on how we think about and work with human systems, both educational systems, corporations, organizations, tech companies. And there are many similarities between different systemic contexts. Now, certain things like legislation, legal changes and framework can bring about change in companies, but more often than not, companies tend to look for assistance when they find themselves blocked with something, when they find themselves blocked with a specific problem. There are a number of contemporary issues that are complicating the current organizational context. You know, there's an increasing legal responsibility on management and organizations to have a duty of care towards their staff. We have an increasingly democratic perception of the workplace and society. Companies are more aware of the need to use talent, the talent that exists in their team, and to look for ways to mine, use, and explore those ways of using that talent. So there's a whole complex number of changes that have occurred, let alone the differences such as working from home, the move from the organization as a static building in the middle of a city to a diverse web of networks between people working at home, working in different contexts, working sometimes even in different countries. So we've moved away from the kind of bricks and sand idea of the organization being the static entity into seeing organizations more relational networks. Okay, and that requires quite a different way of thinking. I'm going to take this really simple example of working with a manager, where when we think we work in an organization, often in a very linear way, and we have very linear ways of thinking about things, we often aren't even aware of the complex dynamic systems impacting upon our thinking and action. So if you think of this event, this organizational event that a manager may look at, or a board member may look at, and the first context of working out is, I must support the strategic objectives of the company. It's a very important context, context A. Context B is, I must meet the technical needs of the assignment. So on one hand, we have the kind of overarching strategic level objectives. On the second level, we have the technical objectives. And the third context is that this manager must maintain good relationships with the superiors and with their colleagues. So the question for this observer, this manager in this context, is, how do I bring together all of these three contexts in a way that prevent me from becoming blocked and allow me to achieve the objective I've been given? And this really speaks to a lot of the complexity that managers deal with. Certainly when I've managed companies, you find it's quite difficult to coordinate all these three different contexts. And normally when you become blocked, or when you are blocked, it's usually in one of these contexts. So is it often at board level? Is it at technical level? Is it at staff level? Is it even at a communication level? And we speak about that in a short while. So we can see here, even the very simple observation of what seems like a primary task for the manager now has a number of very complex layers. And in each of those contexts, behavior will mean a very different thing generally. So at board level, certain behaviors are seen as being useful and helpful, others are seen as being prohibitive. At a staff level, it might be sensible to be difficult to resist change in order to have a good relation with colleagues. At a board level, that might be seen as a very negative trait in employees. So system thinking allows managers and staff to better understand the connection between their behavior, the meaning that's given to that behavior, and the context within which it occurs. When we work in a systemic way, we're hoping that we can get people to understand the effects of their behavior and their thinking and the effect that it has on others. So in linear thinking, we often think that A causes B, cause and effect thinking, very simple mechanical ways of thinking about people sometimes. In systems thinking, we said, cause A creates an effect, B, and B itself becomes a new cause for a new effect. And that new effect acts back upon the old cause. And we create this kind of system way of thinking. The relational interaction between the cause and effect becomes so complex over time as to be useless to understand it in a linear way. Okay, so when we think about an organization, we're also asking ourselves, well, what is an organization? I mean, from my perspective, to think of an organization is to think of something that's goal-directed and meaning-generating. And what does that mean? It means that a group of people have come together to decide to achieve some outcome. And in order to achieve that outcome, a certain meaning around what behaviors are useful and helpful and purposeful to that objective, and which ones are quite unhelpful or not purposeful at that point in time. So we're not talking about a collection of just individuals interacting out of their own best interests, but the organization is something that we create in our mind. Everybody in the organization will have a picture of what that organization is. So we can see here that the organizational culture is the goals, the people, the ways of working, the forms of discipline, leadership, learning, structures, goals. There's a whole host of complex aspects of working within an organizational context. So it's an interacting collection of interests, actions, opportunities, constraints, and objectives. And each one of these different aspects may well be understood differently at a different level. So at a board level, they may well have a very specific understanding of what the goal might be. At a lower level, someone else might have a very different understanding of how to implement that goal. And often the difficulty or the conflict arises between these two contexts. Now, if we begin to apply a linear approach, we may get trapped into a blame game where the staff begin to blame the management for being too obscure, or the management might begin to blame the staff for being too resistant. The difficulty is neither are seeing the double-edged sword that they're both creating for each other. I remember Ross Brawn was the director of Ferrari in the late 1990s, and he'd gone to Deutsche Bank to do a training day, and he asked all of the board members in Deutsche Bank to write down the mission statement for Deutsche Bank. And I think it was 18 or 22 people in the room. Only 2 had written down the similar mission statement. So even at board level, they didn't understand coordinatedly what their meaning and purpose was. And we'll see in a few minutes that if a board or a manager or an organization at the top are espousing, kind of declaring a way of working, but aren't enacting that belief or that way of doing things, then it's very hard to get people lower down the food chain to enact and enable them to enact that same behavior. So we speak about the kind of generative, what we call a generative cascade. So espouse, enact, and enable. That the board or senior management should espouse a way of working. They should enact it, and they should enable others at a lower level, given the right resources, right information, to enact what they are expecting of them. So they have to espouse, enact, and enable. I spoke a few minutes ago about the organization in the mind. everybody in an organization will have a picture of their organization in their mind. And this image or picture drives how they behave, drives their reaction, their behavior, and the meaning they make of things. And in order to make organizations function and function effectively, we need to coordinate these interacting perceptions. And that requires a more complex approach than simply changing policy or having staff education programs or good induction packages where people seem to get to know everything about the company at the start. So the question is, what's the difference? So if we think about linear thinking, so this is kind of Aristotelian kind of or Newtonian kind of thinking of cause and effect. That when we're thinking in a systemic way, we're breaking away from individual component pieces, and we're looking at wholeness, how the whole thing interacts. In linear thinking, we're concerned often with content, but in systems thinking, we're looking at the process. So we're not looking at people detailing things, logging everything that occurred. We're looking at the dynamic pattern that's created in human interaction. And all of these things that are noted here are really about looking at the system in a more whole and complex way. If we step away and we think of the organization as a kind of a beehive of interaction within which language, meaning, behavior all weave together to create a whole, what we call the organization. This picture we have in our mind is shaped by the behavior of others, by the conversations we have between ourselves as staff members, by the goals that are set down to us, and the ways in which we talk about these things. So this also can't be forgotten, that how people talk even at local level of the water cooler will have a dramatic effect on the dynamics in an organization. Now, there are certain things that we bring to an organization as individuals. When we have certain kinds of perceptions, we might be a bit more perfectionistic. You might find that we tend to give up on things, or we avoid certain things, and they may well be patterns we have outside in everyday life. But you can also find that there are behaviors we end up doing in organizations that we generally wouldn't generalize to everyday life. So some things we bring to organizations, other things are a consequence of our participation in the organization. Okay. So when we think in a strategic way, when we think of the organization as a whole, we've got to ask ourselves, how do we work with problems if they arise? From a strategic, systemic, interactional perspective, the first stage is to really look at how the problem occurs, where it occurs, with whom, at what level, who's defining what the problem is, how will we know when the problem is solved, what are the objectives of the consultation with the company or organization, school, family, whatever it might be. And by adopting a kind of what we call knowing through changing approach, we begin to interact with the system in a very cybernetic way, for want of a better word. That is that as we're interacting with the organization, we are changing in our interaction with the organization. So as we see change, we begin to change our behavior, our interaction, our intervention in the organization based on the effects of what we are doing. If the goal is achieved and the organization has arrived to solve the problem, then we can say we've understood how the problem functioned. Okay, we've acquired operative or practical functional knowledge of how the problem works. And there's great organization learning at the end of that and throughout each stage. If we haven't arrived at that goal, then we probably need to go back to the start and redefine what the goal or the objective was. So there are a number of stages to strategic problem solving, starting with defining the problem, agreeing on the objective, evaluating the attempts at solution, thinking of how to worsen technique. There's a whole host of steps and stages to solving problems in complex organizations. But that's not to say that this is a linear process, because each situation here, the problem, the intervention, the strategy that we're using, is continually acting down and up in this ladder. So we're in this continual circular evolution when we're interacting with an organization. It's not once and for all. We don't diagnose the problem at the start and then act in this linear way on the organization. So if we return to what we started with, if we have a manager a board, a chair of a company, and they're looking at some organizational event or interaction. There are so many contexts acting on the person, including external contexts such as the legal or social policy framework that they're working within, that they have to keep in mind all of these competing contexts and how they can weave a narrative, a way of acting, in a way that keeps this whole together. So I always think the best thing is to shift away from universal top-down thinking to bottom-up thinking. So if you have a board or senior people in an organization and they think that they can impose their will, instructively on people lower down the food chain or lower down the organization, then they will come a cropper. Okay, as we say, you will get even trapped and blocked. So we have to think the what can come down from above. So what needs to be done? What are the strategic goals must come down from the top. But how those goals are implemented should be negotiated from the bottom up. When we think systemically, we're thinking from parts to whole. So rather than seeing behavior in an isolated, individualist, blameful way, we ask ourselves, in what context does this behavior make sense? And how might I be contributing to either solving or worsening the current difficulty? We also need to learn ways of shifting from debate to dialogue. What does that mean? Debate is usually about convincing the other person of the right of your ways of doing things. In a dialogical, more conversational approach, we're open to hearing difference. We're open to the idea that we may be wrong or that we may need to change the way we're thinking and acting. So we ask people to shift from debate to a dialogue framework. This a dialogue is, explanation of is the exchange of intelligence between two. Dialogue allows for something new to emerge in a conversation between two people. Debate usually leads to both people coming away even more confirmed in the ideas they had at the start, which leaves the problem back at square one. It's really, really important in this last piece to think that if a board or organization are going to think systemically, then they must espouse or they must demonstrate a way of working and acting. And they must enact that way of working and acting. But further down in the organization, they must enable others to enact their request. So they must be given the right resources. They must have time to dialogue and discuss with others about how that might come about. But we also need to shift away from detail, kind of who said what to whom, to complexity and towards coordinating the meaning we hold between each other, which involves all of these different sections. So when we think systemically, we're thinking about the interactional parts between the individual and the system, between the system and the individual, between how we speak about the organization, and between the behaviors and the context within which certain behaviors make sense. I think Blaise Pascal, and I'll finish on this, I think Blaise Pascal said it best. He said, that words arranged differently have different meanings, but meanings arranged differently have different effects. Okay, thank you.